You think you can fool this court? He sneered, his voice thick with mockery. A child playing attorney? This isn't a school play, young lady. This is a court of law. The murmurs turned into chuckles. Some whispered, exchanging smug glances. Others smirked openly. Amara Collins stood still, unshaken. She met the judge's gaze with the steadiness of someone who had already played out this battle in her mind 100 times. She wasn't here for their approval. She was here for the truth. And then she spoke. The storm before the fight. Amara had always known what it felt like to be underestimated. It had followed her like a shadow, from the classrooms where teachers assumed she wouldn't keep up, to the crowded subways where men barely noticed her as they spread their legs across extra seats. It wasn't about being seen. It was about being heard. She had spent years fighting for that right, earning it through relentless study and unshakable discipline. While other kids watched TV, she devoured law books. While they played outside, she debated college students online. But no amount of preparation could change the reality of standing alone in a courtroom filled with people who didn't believe she belonged there. They weren't just doubting her case. They were doubting her existence in that space. And Amara had never been more certain that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She took a slow breath, feeling the heat of 1,000 stares pressing down on her. The scent of polished wood, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the scratch of pens on legal pads. It was all white noise to her now. The only thing that mattered was the man sitting at the defendant's table. Antonio Marquez, a single father of 2, exhausted but hopeful, clinging to the last thread of stability he had left. His 2 little boys, not even old enough to understand the weight of this trial, sat at the back, their small fingers gripping their grandmother's hands. They were why she was here. Antonio's life had been appended in a single moment. A notice slipped under his door, informing him that he had exactly 14 days to vacate the apartment he had called home for years. No warning. No negotiation. Just cold bureaucracy tearing apart a family. The man responsible sat just a few feet away. Harrison Langston, the kind of landlord who thrived in legal loopholes. He had seen Antonio as nothing more than an easy eviction, powerless tenant who wouldn't fight back. Langston had done this before. But this time, he had miscalculated. Antonio had Amara. She was not a lawyer, not yet, but she had something just as dangerous, a mind built for battle. The laws had never been written for people like Antonio. They had been built for men like Langston, men who knew exactly how to twist words, manipulate contracts, and turn human lives into numbers on a profit sheet. Amara had spent weeks studying every loophole, every possible strategy, searching for the weakness in Langston's case. And she had found it. The eviction was illegal. Hidden beneath the dense legal jargon was a fraudulent claim, a fabrication meant to disguise the fact that Langston had already rented out Antonio's apartment to someone willing to pay double. This was never about lease violations. It was about greed. But knowing the truth wasn't enough. She had to prove it. As she stood in that courtroom, facing a judge who already saw her as a child playing dress-up, she knew she had one chance to turn the tide. One misstep, and she would become exactly what they assumed she was, a joke. But Amara didn't deal in missteps. She inhaled, exhaled, and then she delivered the first blow. "Your Honor, with all due respect," she began, her voice steady, slicing through the remnants of laughter still hanging in the air. "You may believe I don't belong here, but I assure you, my presence in this courtroom is no accident." Judge Grayson's smirk flickered ever so slightly. A shadow of irritation crossed his face. She had his attention. Mr. Marquez is facing eviction based on claims that contradict both state housing laws and the terms of his original lease agreement. I will demonstrate that this eviction is not only unjust, but illegal. The chuckles died down. A new kind of silence took over the room. Not the silence of amusement, but the silence of something else. Curiosity. Langston shifted in his seat, stealing a glance at his lawyer. Antonio, from the corner of her vision, sat up just a little straighter. Judge Grayson leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Is that so?" She saw it then. That flicker of doubt. The crack in the courtroom's walls, in the certainty they had all shared moments ago, that she had already lost before she had begun. She had taken her first step through that crack, and now she was going to break it wide open. The silence in the courtroom was different now. It was no longer the kind that dismissed her, no longer filled with the quiet scorn of men who thought she was out of her depth. It was the silence of anticipation, of shifting attention, of people realizing that this was not the performance of a girl who had wandered into the wrong room. It was the silence that came before the storm. Amara could feel the weight of the judge's gaze pressing against her like a challenge. She could see the prosecutor adjusting his tie, suddenly more focused than before. And she could hear the subtle scrape of Harrison Langston's lawyer turning the pages of his brief, searching for something he might have missed. Antonio Marquez sat motionless beside her. He had spent the last few weeks preparing for the worst, convinced that no one could stand up to the machine that had been set against him. Now, for the first time, there was a sliver of something in his expression. Hope, perhaps, or disbelief that hope could still exist. Amara did not look at him. She could not afford to. If she acknowledged the weight of what she was doing, she might hesitate. If she hesitated, they would tear her apart. The judge cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. "Miss Collins, I assume you have something to support these claims?" Amara met his gaze without faltering. "I do, Your Honor." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, crisp and methodically organized. Every document was exactly where it needed to be, every piece of evidence structured to dismantle the opposition in the most efficient way possible. She stepped forward and handed the first set of documents to the bailiff. The papers moved like a current through the room, passing from hand to hand until they reached the judge. He adjusted his glasses, flipping through them with an unreadable expression. There's no need for theatrics. No need for raised voices or exaggerated gestures. That was the mistake people made when they thought they needed to prove themselves. They tried too hard. They performed. Amara was not performing. She was stating facts, cold, precise, and undeniable. According to the lease agreement signed by Mr. Marquez, he was granted a renewal option for another 3 years at a fixed rental rate. The eviction notice he received claims a lease violation, but no violation is listed. Furthermore, the landlord's official records, which I subpoenaed, show that the apartment was already listed for rent at an increased price before the eviction notice was served. This is a direct violation of state housing laws. The judge did not look at her. He continued to read, flipping the pages at an even, measured pace. The sound of paper shifting against paper filled the room. Amara stood still. She could feel the tension settling in, could feel the growing discomfort of those who had walked into this courtroom expecting an easy win. The prosecutor, a man named Adam Kingsley, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His eyes were sharp now, evaluating her, no longer looking through her. "This is an interesting document," the judge finally said, lifting his gaze. "Where did you get it?" Amara did not blink. "From public records, Your Honor." It was filed by the defendant himself. There was a pause, a long, slow pause that rippled through the room, setting off a series of unspoken calculations. The prosecutor uncrossed his arms, leaning forward. "Your Honor, I would like a recess to review these documents." Amara turned to him. "That won't be necessary. I've taken the liberty of highlighting the relevant sections. You will find that the numbers speak for themselves." The judge sighed, rubbing his temple with 2 fingers before setting the folder down. His amusement was gone now. In its place was something heavier. Langston's lawyer shifted in his seat, whispering something to his client. Langston's jaw was tight, his fingers tapping against the table in a controlled rhythm. This was the part where they realized she was not a minor inconvenience. This was the part where they understood she was dangerous. The judge exhaled slowly. "Mr. Kingsley, do you have a response?" The prosecutor hesitated for half a second. A fraction of time, but enough. He wasn't sure. Langston turned toward him, his face dark with restrained anger. Amara watched them, absorbing their reactions, reading them like an open book. She knew how men like Langston operated. They did not panic when the law came for them. They panicked when they realized it could actually win. Antonio still had not moved. He sat as if frozen, as if afraid that acknowledging this moment might somehow undo it. Amara's heartbeat was steady. Her hands were steady. She had prepared for this. She had spent nights combing through every possible strategy, every counterargument, every loophole they might attempt to slip through. She knew what was coming next. Kingsley straightened his tie. "Your Honor, I believe we will need additional time to verify the authenticity of these documents." The judge cut him off with a look. They were pulled from public record, Mr. Kingsley. If you would like to argue against the credibility of your own client's filing history, you are welcome to try. The prosecutor closed his mouth. Amara did not allow herself to feel satisfaction. This was only the first step. The real battle had yet to begin. The judge looked down at the folder once more, tapping a single finger against the table. Then, finally, he closed it and set it aside. He turned to Langston. Mr. Langston, do you have anything to say for yourself? Langston clenched his jaw. I have a right to manage my property as I see fit. The judge raised an eyebrow. Not illegally, you don't. Another ripple through the room. A slow, shifting tide of realization. Langston exhaled through his nose, but he did not speak. Antonio at last moved. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table, knuckles white. The judge leaned back. This court will take a short recess. The gavel struck, and the room erupted into noise. Amara remained still. She knew that this was far from over. She knew that Langston was not the kind of man who lost quietly. But she also knew something else. For the first time, Langston was afraid. And that meant she was winning. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the judge's gavel struck, signaling to recess. Lawyers leaned toward their clients, whispering in hushed tones. Spectators exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others smirking. Even the journalists, seated in the back row with their notepads and recorders, scribbled with renewed energy. The mood in the room had shifted. The case that had seemed like a mere formality now carried weight, and at the center of it all stood a girl no one had taken seriously. Amara remained still. She knew better than to celebrate too early. A temporary silence was not a victory, only a brief pause before the inevitable counterattack. Langston was not the kind of man who backed down just because someone put him in a corner. He was the kind of man who clawed his way out, who struck harder when he felt threatened. And she had just threatened him. Antonio turned to her, his expression a mixture of astonishment and uncertainty. His fingers still gripped the edge of the table, as though afraid that letting go might cause the walls around him to crumble. Amara, he started, his voice quiet enough to be swallowed by the noise in the room. He hesitated, as if trying to decide whether to say what he was thinking. I don't know how you did that. She didn't respond immediately. What was there to say? That she had spent countless nights preparing for every possible counterargument? That she had memorized every statute that could work in their favor? That she had expected the judge to dismiss her outright and had prepared her words like arrows, ready to pierce through every wall they placed in her way? Instead, she offered him something simpler. We're not done yet. Antonio nodded, but his shoulders remained tense. He had spent too many years watching people like Langston win. It was difficult to believe that this time might be different. Amara straightened her posture, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer. Across the room, Langston sat stiffly in his chair, his lawyer whispering something in his ear. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the judge, at the bailiff, at the people gathering in the aisles, but not at her. Because acknowledging her meant acknowledging that she had power in this fight. She held his gaze anyway. For a brief second, their eyes met. His expression was unreadable, anger carefully masked behind the indifference of a man used to controlling every situation he entered. But Amara saw through it. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers twitched against the polished wood of the table. He was rattled. That was good. Antonio exhaled beside her, his voice almost a whisper. If this works. Amara didn't need him to finish the sentence. She knew what was at stake for him. His home, his children, the stability he had fought so hard to keep. If this worked, he would be able to stay. If it didn't, he would lose everything. The bailiff called for order, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. The judge had returned. The room quieted as Judge Grayson took his seat. He adjusted his glasses, tapped his fingers against the edge of his desk, then glanced toward the opposing side. Mr. Kingsley, I trust you've had enough time to review the documents? Kingsley nodded, though the hesitation was visible. Your Honor, while the evidence presented by Miss Collins is compelling, we would like to request additional time to conduct a full review. Given the weight of these claims, Amara spoke before he could finish. The weight of these claims is precisely why this case needs to be resolved now, Your Honor. The judge turned to her. Miss Collins, the defendant filed an eviction under false pretenses, she continued, voice firm but controlled. Delaying these proceedings would allow him to continue his attempts to displace Mr. Marquez while we debate facts that are already clear. The evidence is public record. We do not need more time to prove what is already in front of us. A pause stretched through the room. The judge sighed. Mr. Kingsley, unless you have a direct counterargument to the validity of these documents, I see no reason to delay. Langston's jaw tightened. His lawyer sat rigid beside him, flipping through papers as if searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. Kingsley cleared his throat. Your Honor, You will present your defense, the judge interrupted. But this case is proceeding today. The gavel struck again. A ripple of reaction moved through the crowd. Antonio exhaled slowly, his grip on the table loosening. Langston finally turned to look at Amara. Not past her, not through her, at her. His gaze was sharp, calculating. She met his stare head-on. He had underestimated her. That had been his first mistake. And now he was starting to realize it. The judge gestured for Kingsley to proceed. The prosecutor straightened, adjusting his tie with a kind of deliberate slowness that suggested he was trying to regain his footing. Your Honor, he started, while the evidence presented does raise concerns, the prosecution intends to demonstrate that Mr. Marquez's lease violations justify the eviction. Amara knew what was coming. They were shifting their strategy. They would no longer argue that the eviction was legitimate. They would try to paint Antonio as a tenant who had no right to be protected. This was not a battle over legality anymore. It was a battle over perception. Antonio stiffened beside her, as if sensing the shift. He wasn't a legal expert, but he had spent his entire life navigating the fine print of systems designed to work against him. They weren't trying to win by the law. They were trying to make him look like someone who deserved to lose. Amara's hands remained steady, but she felt the weight of it pressing down. She had anticipated this. She had studied every possible route they could take, every possible accusation they could twist into something that might be taken as truth. But that didn't mean this would be easy. The prosecutor turned toward the judge, a document in hand. Your Honor, we'd like to introduce new evidence. Amara's pulse remained steady. She had expected this. What she had not expected was the way Langston smirked, just slightly, as the papers were passed forward. For the first time, Amara felt something shift. The fight was changing, and she didn't know why yet. The judge accepted the papers, flipping through them, his expression darkening with each page. And then he looked up. Miss Collins, he said slowly, his voice laced with something that sent a chill down her spine. Do you have a response to this? She hadn't seen the papers yet, but she already knew. Langston had found something. Or worse, he had created it. Amara had spent weeks preparing for this case. She had memorized every argument, anticipated every loophole, and studied every potential counter. But as the judge's fingers gripped the stack of newly introduced documents, she knew something was wrong. Langston had found something. Or more likely, he had manufactured something. The shift in the judge's tone was subtle, but undeniable. The weight of his gaze bore into her as he tapped the corner of the document against his desk, his brow furrowed in unreadable contemplation. The courtroom had fallen into an eerie stillness, as if the very air had thickened, making it difficult to breathe. Amara exhaled slowly, grounding herself. Panic was the enemy of reason. She couldn't afford hesitation, not now. The judge finally spoke. Miss Collins, before we proceed, I will allow you time to review this evidence. The bailiff approached her table, placing the documents before her with practiced efficiency. Amara forced herself to move with the same level of control, reaching for the papers with steady hands. The weight of Langston's stare pressed against her, but she refused to look at him. She scanned the first page, then the second. By the third, she understood. The evidence was fabricated, but convincing. A detailed breakdown of supposed lease violations, a financial discrepancy implying Antonio had misrepresented his income, and a signed witness statement claiming that unauthorized occupants had been living in the apartment. None of it was true. But proving a lie in the face of a well-forged document was far harder than exposing a missing truth. Antonio shifted beside her, leaning in. What is it? His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of dread. She didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, she flipped the pages faster, her mind moving through every possible response. There was no signature from Antonio on these supposed violations. No formal notice had been given to him before the eviction filing, but the documents were detailed, lined with timestamps, false complaints, and ledger inconsistencies that had never existed before. Langston had planned this. She glanced up briefly, watching as his lawyers sat still, waiting. Kingsley, the prosecutor, was watching her too, trying to gauge her reaction. He wasn't sure if the documents were legitimate or not, and that meant he wasn't fully confident in what he was presenting. That was her opening. She exhaled softly, setting the papers down. Then she spoke. "Your Honor, I'd like to request verification of this evidence." The judge lifted a brow. "You're challenging its authenticity?" "I am." She kept her voice even, unshaken. "There are inconsistencies in these records that warrant further scrutiny." The prosecutor adjusted his tie. "Miss Collins, these are official records." "They are recent records," she corrected, folding her hands over the table. "Which means they need to be verified before being used as grounds to justify eviction." The judge regarded her for a long moment. Then he turned to Kingsley. "Mr. Kingsley, do you have reason to believe these documents are legitimate beyond reasonable doubt?" A hesitation. A crack in the opposition. Amara leaned into it. If the prosecution is certain, they shouldn't object to a brief review of their accuracy. She saw Langston shift slightly, his lips pressing into a thin line. Kingsley exhaled through his nose, visibly debating his next move. If he pushed too hard and the documents were revealed to be fraudulent, the entire case would crumble under the weight of deliberate evidence tampering. If he withdrew them too easily, it would suggest weakness. Finally, he nodded. "We have no issue with verification, Your Honor." Langston's jaw ticked. He hadn't expected Kingsley to bend. The judge turned toward the bailiff. "Send these to verification immediately. This case will not proceed until authenticity is confirmed." Amara remained still, but inside, she felt the slightest drop of relief. It wasn't over, not even close, but she had bought time. The judge continued. "Since we will not be moving forward with this evidence until verification is completed, let's return to the original argument. Miss Collins, you may proceed with your case." Amara inhaled, pushing the weight of distraction aside. She turned back to the document she had originally presented, returning to the foundation she had spent weeks building. The lease agreement between Mr. Marquez and the defendant includes a renewal clause that was improperly disregarded in the eviction notice, she began, her voice calm and controlled. Furthermore, the defendant relisted the property at a higher rate before the eviction was even filed, indicating financial motive behind this case rather than any legitimate lease violation. Kingsley, still recovering from the shift in strategy, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, while the timing of the listing is unfortunate, that does not prove intent." Amara didn't miss a beat. "The pattern does." She turned the next page in her folder, placing a stack of printed reports before the judge. "These are records of other evictions filed by the defendant in the last 2 years. The pattern is clear. Lower-income tenants are regularly forced out under vague claims of violations, only for their units to be rented out at an increased price. The eviction process is being weaponized for profit." A murmur spread through the audience. The judge flipped through the pages, his frown deepening. Langston remained still, his fingers pressed tightly together. His lawyer was the first to react. "Your Honor, this is circumstantial. This is consistent," Amara countered smoothly. "And it demonstrates motive. My client is not an isolated case. He is part of a deliberate practice." Silence settled again. The judge exhaled through his nose, setting the papers aside. "This case is taking a very different turn," he said, his voice heavy. Amara knew what that meant. Langston did too. This was no longer a simple eviction case. This was the beginning of an exposure. The walls were closing in, and Langston was running out of room to move. But Amara also knew one more thing. When powerful men started to lose, they stopped playing by the rules. She needed to be ready, because this fight was about to get dirtier. The judge's words lingered in the air long after they were spoken. "This case is taking a very different turn." For a brief moment, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Amara could feel the weight of it pressing against her, the charged anticipation of something shifting. This was no longer just a simple tenant eviction case. It had become something much larger, a legal battle that could expose systemic corruption and rattle the very foundation of Langston's empire. And Langston knew it. She could see it in the stiffness of his posture, the way his lawyer's fingers tapped anxiously against his briefcase. They had entered this courtroom expecting a formality, a swift eviction, powerless tenant, a girl who had no place standing at a legal podium. But now the terrain had changed beneath their feet. Langston leaned slightly toward his lawyer, whispering something under his breath. His expression remained carefully neutral, but Amara caught the slight flicker in his eyes when he glanced toward her. It was different from before. It wasn't indifference, nor was it dismissal. It was calculation. He was adjusting. That meant he still had a play to make. Amara couldn't afford to relax, not even for a second. The judge exhaled slowly, as if already feeling the burden of what this case was about to become. He turned toward the prosecution. "Mr. Kingsley, your response." Kingsley sat straighter, regaining some of his composure. The moment of hesitation he had shown earlier was gone, replaced by the cool confidence of a man who had argued in courtrooms far grander than this one. "Your Honor," he began, adjusting his tie with a measured slowness. "While Miss Collins has presented an interesting narrative, it is still just that, a narrative. Correlation does not equal causation, and simply highlighting a pattern does not prove that my client has acted outside the boundaries of the law." Amara didn't flinch. She had expected this. "Patterns are not coincidences, Your Honor," she countered, "especially when they follow a consistent timeline and financial incentive. Mr. Langston has filed 12 eviction notices over the last 2 years, every single one of them against low-income tenants, predominantly people of color, and every single unit has been relisted at a significantly higher price within days of the eviction." She took a slow step forward, letting the silence settle before delivering her next point. "This is not bad luck for the tenants. This is a business model." A ripple of reaction moved through the courtroom. Journalists whispered among themselves, pens scratching furiously against notepads. Some spectators leaned in closer, their expressions shifting from mild curiosity to genuine interest. The judge's brow furrowed. Langston's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, and Kingsley, for the first time, seemed to hesitate. It was a small hesitation, but enough. Amara pressed forward. "If this were just a coincidence, then surely my client's eviction notice would include clear violations. But it doesn't, because they don't exist." She turned toward Antonio, whose hands were clenched together in his lap, his knuckles pale from pressure. "Mr. Marquez has lived in his apartment for 5 years. He has never missed a rent payment. There have been no prior complaints. Yet he is suddenly facing an eviction for an unspecified violation?" And she turned back toward Langston, her voice sharp, unyielding. His apartment was already listed for rent at a higher price before he was even notified. Langston's lawyer finally spoke up. "This is a dangerous accusation, Your Honor," he said, his tone carefully controlled. "My client is a businessman, not a villain from a conspiracy novel. He manages multiple properties. The fact that some listings overlap with evictions is purely coincidental." Amara tilted her head slightly. "Is that so?" She reached into her bag and pulled out another document, a financial report. "This," she said, setting the paper down, "is a transaction record from Langston Property Holdings. It details property revenue increases immediately following each eviction. Notice the exact correlation between the increased rent rates and the tenant removals. This isn't mismanagement. It's deliberate financial engineering." Langston's lawyer hesitated. He turned to Kingsley, but Kingsley said nothing. For the first time, Amara saw real concern in their faces. But she wasn't done yet. "Your Honor," she continued, "this is no longer just a case about a single eviction. This is a case of systemic tenant exploitation. If we allow this eviction to proceed without further investigation, we are enabling a practice that systematically targets vulnerable families for profit." The judge was silent for several long seconds. He exhaled, his fingers tapping against the wood of his desk. "Mr. Kingsley," he said finally, "I'm inclined to agree that there is more here than a simple lease dispute. Before I proceed further, I want a full review of Mr. Langston's recent eviction records and financial transactions." Langston's composure cracked. UST slightly. Amara caught it, the tight clench of his jaw, the way his shoulders stiffened for a fraction of a second. He knew what was coming, and for the first time, he knew he might not be able to stop it. The judge turned toward the bailiff. "Secure those records immediately." Langston's lawyer stood abruptly. "Your Honor, we request an immediate recess." Denied, the judge interrupted. This court will continue. And Mr. Langston, his gaze hardened. If there is anything in your records that supports Miss Collins' claims, you may want to prepare yourself for more than just this case. Langston's hands curled into fists beneath the table. Amara did not look away. She had him now. But she also knew that when men like Langston started to lose, they stopped playing fair. And something in his eyes told her that he wasn't done fighting yet. The weight in the room had shifted. The air was thick with the kind of tension that only arose when power was being threatened. Langston sat rigid, his fingers drumming against the table in slow, measured beats. His lawyer leaned in toward him, whispering something low and urgent. Whatever was being said didn't matter. Amara had seen it before, the quiet desperation of men who had never been challenged realizing, too late, that they had underestimated their opponent. The judge's ruling was clear. Langston's records would be reviewed in full. His history of evictions, his financial transactions, every instance of a tenant being removed just before a rent increase, exposed to the scrutiny of the court. Langston had built his success on loopholes and silence. Now the silence was breaking. Amara knew better than to let her guard down. A man like Langston wouldn't accept defeat. He would search for another way out, another move to make. She could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, the calculations running behind his carefully controlled expression. Antonio sat motionless beside her, his posture tense, as if still bracing for the inevitable moment where everything would turn against him again. He had spent too many years losing to believe in winning. Amara couldn't afford to let doubt creep in. She turned her attention back to Kingsley, the prosecutor. He had been measuring her since the moment she took control of the argument. He had started this trial dismissing her, but now there was a different glint in his eyes, one that told her he was starting to wonder if he had miscalculated. He wasn't looking at Langston anymore. He was watching her, and that meant something. The judge cleared his throat, shifting the weight of the courtroom back to him. We will proceed with reviewing the financial records. Until then, I'm placing a temporary injunction on the eviction. Mr. Marquez will remain in his residence until further notice. The words landed. Antonio inhaled sharply beside her, but he didn't say anything. He was still processing it. The reality of it. For the first time, he wasn't just delaying the inevitable, he was standing on equal ground. Langston's lawyer stood again, his voice clipped with forced control. Your Honor, this is an unnecessary complication to what should have been a straightforward eviction case. You mean to say it's an inconvenient complication, Mr. Sterling? The judge interrupted, his voice sharp. This court will not ignore potential patterns of financial exploitation simply because they are inconvenient to your client's bottom line. Langston's lawyer sat down without another word. Amara kept her breathing even, her fingers tightening against the edge of the table. This was progress. But it wasn't over. The judge continued. Court will reconvene after the verification of these records. I expect full compliance. Langston didn't move. The gavel struck. The sound echoed through the room. People began to shift, murmuring amongst themselves. Journalists had already begun typing furiously, their whispers carrying an energy that told her she had changed the shape of the story they were telling. But Amara wasn't watching them. She was watching Langston. He stood slowly, his movements controlled. Too controlled. His lawyer leaned in again, but this time, Langston didn't respond. He turned his head slightly, just enough to look at her. A slow, assessing glance. It wasn't anger. It was a warning. And that was how she knew he wasn't done yet. Outside the courtroom, Antonio released a slow breath, running a hand over his face as if trying to physically shake off the weight of the last few hours. His mother stood a few feet away, holding his children's hands, whispering something to them softly. They can't kick me out, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Amara nodded. Not yet. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. You think they'll find something in the records? They don't need to, she replied, crossing her arms. What we've already shown is enough to prove intent. But if there's something more, if there's any financial fraud, any falsified paperwork, anything illegal, then this case won't just be about keeping your home. His jaw tensed. It'll be about taking Langston down. She didn't say it, but he already knew. Amara had spent years studying the law. She had read through every case where landlords had been caught exploiting vulnerable tenants. Some had walked away untouched. Others had been dragged into long, messy trials that exposed the full extent of their corruption. Langston wasn't just an opportunist. He was a businessman who had perfected the art of legal loopholes. And men like him didn't operate without leaving something behind. It was only a matter of finding it. But there was something else nagging at her. Something deeper than the financial records. Langston had looked at her differently today. Not just as an opponent, but as a problem. And problems, for men like Langston, were meant to be eliminated. That night, Amara sat at her desk, flipping through everything she had gathered so far. The city lights outside her window flickered against the glass, casting sharp reflections over the stacks of legal papers and reports sprawled in front of her. Her laptop screen glowed softly in the dim room, the cursor blinking as she ran another background check on Langston's business history. Something wasn't adding up. She knew how these men worked. They didn't fight battles they weren't certain they could win. So why had Langston let this case get this far? Why hadn't he paid Antonio off before it ever reached court? Why hadn't he used his influence to make the case disappear? Something was missing. Her phone buzzed beside her. She hesitated before picking it up. Unknown caller. She let it ring twice. Then she answered. Silence. Then a low, controlled voice. You need to walk away. A chill settled over her. She said nothing. The voice continued. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Miss Collins. This isn't your fight. Her grip tightened around the phone. She refused to let any fear creep into her voice. I know exactly what I'm dealing with. A quiet chuckle. Oh, calculated. No, you don't. But you will. The line went dead. Amara stayed still for a moment, the weight of the words pressing into her like an unseen force. She wasn't just fighting a corrupt landlord anymore. She was fighting something bigger. And whoever had just called her, they were making it clear that she wasn't supposed to win. The dial tone still hummed in her ears long after the call had ended. Amara sat motionless, her fingers tightening around the edges of her phone. The weight of the conversation settled in her chest like a stone, but she refused to let it take root. You need to walk away. It wasn't a threat. Not directly. It was something colder. Something more dangerous. A warning. She forced herself to breathe slowly, setting the phone down on her desk. The dim glow of her laptop screen illuminated the scattered legal documents in front of her, proof of Langston's pattern of evictions, reports of his financial maneuvering, records of tenants who had been forced out under suspiciously similar circumstances. But none of it was enough. Not yet. She needed something concrete, something that couldn't be dismissed as a coincidence or a simple business practice. Her gut told her that Langston had left breadcrumbs, whether he meant to or not. And the voice on the phone, that only confirmed it. She wasn't just dealing with a corrupt landlord anymore. She was dealing with a system, one that had been running smoothly until she stepped in and started forcing people to pay attention. And now someone wanted her gone. She exhaled sharply, shaking off the weight of the moment. Fear was useless. Action was everything. Her fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, pulling up Langston's corporate filings, scanning through real estate deals, tenant complaints, lawsuits, anything that connected him to something bigger than an eviction dispute. She scrolled through page after page, her eyes moving faster, absorbing names, addresses, transaction records, until something caught her attention. A shell company. Greenpoint Holdings. It was registered under a nondescript office address, linked to Langston's primary corporation, but the real kicker was the timing. The company had been used in multiple land purchases right before mass evictions took place. She clicked deeper. Several of the properties Greenpoint Holdings had acquired had been resold within weeks, flipped for a significantly higher price after the original tenants were forced out. This wasn't just a landlord pushing rent hikes. This was real estate fraud. And if Langston had been moving money through shell companies, there was a trail to follow. She leaned back, tapping her fingers against the desk. She had enough to dig deeper. But she needed a way in. Her mind raced through possibilities. The financials. If Langston had been laundering money, there had to be falsified records, manipulated transactions, proof. And there was only one person who had access to the raw numbers inside Langston's company. His accountant. Amara sat up straighter, pulling up the corporate filings again. She scrolled through the listed names, searching for anyone who had signed financial disclosures, anyone who handled Langston's money. Then she found it. Michael Holloway, a mid-level corporate accountant who had worked under Langston for 6 years. No major online presence. No obvious red flags. But she could already tell. If there was fraud, he was the one keeping it clean. Her next step was clear. She had to talk to him. The next afternoon, Amara sat outside a small cafe in the business district, her fingers wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee. Across the street, the glass entrance of a law firm reflected the afternoon sun, and beyond that, Holloway's office. She had found his lunch routine easily enough. He left his office at exactly 12:15 p.m. every day, walked 2 blocks, and sat at the same table at a cafe corner seat, always alone, which meant he had no excuse to ignore her. At 12:17, she saw him. A short man in his late 40s, wearing a too-tight button-up and glasses that kept slipping down his nose. He walked with the hesitation of someone who spent his life avoiding attention. Perfect. She stood, crossing the street and entering the cafe just as he sat down with his lunch. He barely glanced up before pulling out his phone, scrolling absent-mindedly. Amara slid into the seat across from him. Michael Holloway. His head snapped up, eyes widening. Ahoo, he blinked rapidly, setting his phone down. Who are you? She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Someone who knows you've been cleaning Langston's messes for years. His expression froze. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. I know about Greenpoint Holdings. I know how the money moves. And I know that if someone audits those books, you are the one who will take the fall. A nervous swallow. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. She pulled out a folded document from her bag, a printout of financial transactions linked to Langston's holdings. You signed off on these. Your name. Your approval. She placed the paper in front of him. You're part of it, whether you meant to be or not. He stared at the paper, his fingers twitching slightly. A bead of sweat formed near his temple. Amara didn't give him a chance to compose himself. You know what happens next, right? She continued. Langston will throw you under the bus. If this case escalates, if fraud charges come into play, you're the one who goes down first. Not him. You. Michael licked his lips, his eyes darting toward the exit. She leaned back slightly. But there's a way out. You help me, I help you. You tell me what Langston's hiding, the real numbers, the falsified accounts, and I make sure this doesn't land on you. Silence. Then a whisper. I can't. His voice was barely audible, his shoulders tense. You can. Amara's voice was steady. Or you can wait for the feds to knock on your door first. Michael exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. He was cracking. She could see it. Finally, he swallowed hard. Then, without looking at her, he muttered, Meet me after office hours. Parking garage. I'll tell you when I can. Amara stood. She had what she needed. I'll be there. She walked away without another word. But as she exited the cafe, a familiar chill crawled down her spine. Someone was watching. She didn't turn her head, didn't slow her pace, but she could feel it, the presence of someone tracking her movements. Langston's people. They knew she was getting too close, and they weren't going to wait for her to make the next move. Amara had always known the stakes would rise the deeper she dug, but feeling watched was different than anticipating a fight. As she walked away from the cafe, she kept her pace even, her breathing steady, resisting the urge to turn around. Whoever was following her wanted her to know they were there. That was a message, a way of saying, we see you. We know what you're doing. She didn't stop. She didn't hesitate. Fear was a trap, and she refused to fall into it. By the time she reached her apartment, the tension in her shoulders had turned into something sharper. This was no longer just about winning a legal battle. It was about survival. She locked the door behind her and pulled the curtains closed, pacing the room as she replayed everything in her mind. Langston's empire was built on the illusion of legality, a system designed to exploit, but never to be caught. But now that system was unraveling, thread by thread. And the more pressure she applied, the more desperate he became. Michael Holloway had agreed to talk. That meant Langston's financial secrets were real and fragile. If Holloway cracked, the entire house of cards would collapse. That also meant Langston couldn't afford to let her meet him tonight. Amara took a slow breath, reaching for her laptop. If they were watching her, then she had to stay ahead of them. She needed leverage. Opening her encrypted files, she pulled up everything she had compiled. Tenant testimonies, financial records, eviction notices, relistings of properties with inflated rental prices. But what she needed was the final proof, the evidence that could turn this from an expose into an indictment. Holloway had it. She just had to get to him before Langston did. The parking garage was almost empty when Amara arrived later that night. The air smelled of concrete and engine fumes, the fluorescent lights above buzzing softly. She kept her hands in her pockets, her pulse slow and measured, scanning the area as she stepped deeper into the dimly lit structure. Holloway was late. Or worse, he wasn't coming. A quiet footstep echoed nearby. Amara turned her head slightly, her senses on high alert. Then movement. A dark sedan, engine idling near the far exit. Someone sat in the driver's seat, barely visible through the tinted windows. She wasn't alone. Her mind raced through possibilities. Was this a setup? Had they gotten to Holloway first? Her fingers brushed over her phone in her pocket, ready to dial. Then she saw him. Michael Holloway emerged from a side entrance, his movements hurried, his gaze darting nervously around the garage. He clutched a messenger bag against his chest like a lifeline. She walked toward him, careful but deliberate. Holloway. He flinched at his own name, looking around again before closing the distance between them. You were followed, he muttered, his voice tight. I know, she said evenly. They've been watching me all day. Holloway exhaled sharply, gripping the strap of his bag. This is bad. Worse than I thought. I shouldn't be here. She held his gaze. Then why are you? A flicker of something passed over his face, fear, but also guilt. Because they're going to pin it all on me, he said, voice low. Langston, his lawyers, when this all comes down, I'll be the fall guy. She didn't disagree. That was exactly how these things worked. But I can't let that happen, he went on, licking his lips. I have proof. The real accounts. The falsified numbers. Every time Langston moved money through Greenpoint Holdings, I documented it. Just in case. Her pulse quickened. Where? In here. He clutched the bag tighter. I have copies on a drive. If you can get this into the right hands, it'll prove everything. Amara reached for it, but Holloway hesitated. There's something else, he whispered, his eyes flicking over her shoulder. This isn't just about Langston. There are other names in those files. Bigger names. She frowned. Who? His throat worked as he swallowed. Developers. Investors. Politicians. Her breath caught for half a second. If that was true, then this wasn't just a single corruption case. This was an entire network, a web of money, power, and influence stretching far beyond Langston himself. And she had just stepped into the center of it. A noise behind them, the car door opening. Holloway flinched. They're here. Before she could react, he shoved the bag into her hands. Take it. His voice was urgent, desperate. Don't stop. Don't go home. Get this to someone who can protect it. Amara barely had time to grip the strap before Holloway turned and bolted in the opposite direction, vanishing between parked cars. She didn't wait. She ran. Behind her, the sedan's engine roared to life. Footsteps pounded against pavement. A shout, someone giving orders. Her pulse slammed against her ribs as she sprinted toward the nearest stairwell. She couldn't be caught. Not now. Not with this evidence. She hit the door at full speed, shoving through it as heavy footsteps followed. They were chasing her. Amara took the stairs 2 at a time, gripping the strap of the bag, adrenaline burning through her veins. They wanted her to be afraid. They wanted her to run into a corner. But she wasn't trapped. They were. Because now she had something bigger than all of them. And she wasn't letting it go. Amara's breath burned in her lungs as she raced up the stairwell, gripping the messenger bag like her life depended on it. And in this moment, it did. Footsteps pounded behind her, closing in. Whoever Langston had sent wasn't playing games. They weren't here to threaten her. They were here to make sure she never left this garage with the evidence. She forced her mind to stay sharp. Panic was a trap. Focus was survival. 3 flights up, a door loomed to her left. Emergency exit leading to the next level of the parking structure. She took the risk. Slamming into the door with her shoulder, she burst into the open air of the upper level. The fluorescent lights above cast sharp shadows across the empty lot. No one else was up here. Good and bad. She sprinted toward the farthest exit, scanning the area for an escape route. The city pulsed beyond the structure's edges, but she had to get down there first. The door behind her crashed open. Amara didn't look back. A voice shouted, "Stop." She didn't. Her eyes locked onto a service ladder bolted against the far wall, leading to the street level below. It wasn't ideal. It was dangerous. But so was staying here. She didn't hesitate. Racing forward, she leapt for the ladder, gripping the cold metal bars as she swung herself over the edge of the structure. One wrong move, one slip, and she'd be a story on the morning news. The footsteps behind her skidded to a halt. Whoever had been chasing her hadn't expected this. She climbed down fast, her hands burning against the metal. The ground rushed up toward her, the city sounds growing louder, honking cars, distant sirens, life moving on while she was hanging between survival and disaster. Then impact. Her feet hit pavement. She stumbled but didn't stop. The street was busy, cars, people, the endless motion of the city. If she could just disappear into the crowd. Tires screeched behind her. A black SUV pulled onto the curb, blocking her path. She froze for a fraction of a second, scanning for an opening. Another escape. Then a voice. Calm. Hold. Too familiar. Enough of this. Langston. He stood beside the open door of the SUV, one hand adjusting his suit jacket. He looked unbothered, like this was nothing more than a business inconvenience. His eyes flicked toward the bag slung across her body. You have something that belongs to me. Amara clenched her jaw, keeping her stance firm even as her pulse slammed against her ribs. Actually, I have something that belongs to the court. Langston exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You don't understand what you're getting yourself into. I understand exactly what I'm doing, she shot back. And I think the feds will too, once they see what's inside this bag. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. A sliver of amusement. Or respect. You're brave, he admitted. But bravery won't protect you from the people this will expose. Amara took a slow step backward, scanning the street for any advantage. Langston sighed. This is your last chance. Hand it over. Walk away. You're smart enough to know when a fight isn't worth it. She let out a short, humorless laugh. Funny. That's exactly what I was about to tell you. A pause. Langston's expression remained unreadable. Then, finally, he nodded to the man beside him. A black-clad figure stepped toward her. She moved first. Amara turned and ran, shoving past pedestrians, darting into the chaos of the city street. The crowd became her shield, her cover, bodies moving, cars honking, voices rising in protest as she wove through them. Langston wouldn't make a scene here. Not in public. She didn't stop. She didn't slow down. She knew where she had to go. By the time she reached the courthouse, her chest was tight, her muscles aching from the relentless pace. But she was here. And she had won. Security barely glanced at her as she entered, her steps echoing against the marble floors. She didn't hesitate. She went straight for the district attorney's office. Inside, the receptionist blinked at her in surprise. Can I help? Amara slammed a bag onto the counter. I have evidence of real estate fraud, money laundering, and falsified documents connected to a statewide corruption ring. I need to speak with the DA. No. Silence. Then movement. The receptionist scrambled to pick up the phone. Wait here. Amara exhaled, hands still clenched around the strap of the bag. It was over. No, not over. But it had begun. The fallout came fast. Langston was arrested within 24 hours. The charges against him were damning: fraud, illegal evictions, financial crimes. But the real shock came when the investigation spread beyond him. Names started coming out. Developers, investors, politicians. It wasn't just Langston. It was an entire system, and now the whole world was watching it burn. Antonio got to keep his home, and so did hundreds of others. Amara became a name people recognized. A face on news stories, the attorney who took on corruption and won. But she didn't celebrate. She didn't slow down. Because this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning.